and a sweating pitcher of sweet tea to the doctor as he worked in his outbuilding laboratory, once a tobacco barn, now converted into a den of research. Lifting the silver tray with steady hands, she walked the narrow path. As she neared the building, muffled voices reached her ears, rising in sharper tones with each step. Dr. Harwick was not alone. He was in the midst of a debate with a dignified guest from Richmond whose voice Nancy recognized instantly. It belonged to Dr. Samuel Cartwright, the notorious physician who had become celebrated across the South for his so-called discoveries concerning the supposed mental deficiencies of the enslaved. This was the man who had coined drapetomania, a fabricated disease invented to explain why enslaved people risked everything to escape, the same man who declared that dysesthesia ethiopica accounted for what he called laziness and resistance among black laborers. Nancy slowed her steps. Pausing at the wall of the barn, she pretended to adjust the items on her tray, but her true intention was to listen. Through a splintering crack in the aged wood, her eyes caught a partial glimpse of the scene within. Two men bent low over a long table, its surface spread with diagrams, skull charts, and rows of precise measurements, visual proof of the cruel science in which her life had already been ensnared. The interior walls of the repurposed barn were crowded with shelving, those shelves stacked with glass containers brimming with strange substances of every shade. Beside them stood an array of scientific devices whose shapes Nancy could not identify, and lined along the back were dozens of thick, leather-bound journals, each volume bristling with neat handwriting, the cumulative record of years of trials, observations, and macabre experimentation. Peering through the narrow split in the wood, Nancy overheard an exchange whose eerie word would remain carved into her memory for the rest of her days. The two men bent over maps of skulls, columns of measurements, and diagrams laid out like architectural plans. Their discussion flowed in the language of schedules and pedigrees, the blithe planning of a breeding program, as though the lives of flesh and blood people could be reduced to nothing more than the pairing of farm animals. Cartwright's voice carried, calm yet chilling, as he lectured on how specific African lineages, when intermingled, would yield children stamped with predictable physical and intellectual traits. Such results, he boasted, could be charted, studied, and paraded as the ultimate proof of racial hierarchy. Pointing at one parchment, he gestured toward a name scrawled with care and hemmed in by precise numerical notations. This female specimen, the one you've labeled here, exhibits cranial dimensions remarkable for her people, he commented, his finger tracing over Nancy's charts. His tone hardened. The subject shows signs of higher intelligence that must be carefully bred out. Allowing such exceptions to reproduce unchecked will undermine the very theories upon which all of this stands. If left unchallenged, abolitionists could seize on her example as ammunition against us. Dr. Harwick leaned forward, practically quivering with enthusiasm, his eyes glittering as he studied the paper. "I have already chosen male sources that conform to your specifications," he replied. "The process will begin within weeks. I have prepared facilities to exert full influence over dietary, environmental, and developmental factors from conception through early childhood. Offspring who exhibit traits outside of expectation will of course be removed in accordance with protocol." Cold dread pooled in Nancy's chest as recognition struck. They were talking about her sisters, not as women, but not as breeding material for a grotesque design. Her horror deepened when Cartwright unclasped a leather satchel with deliberate motions and produced a row of delicate glass vials. 20 hours of agony that Rebecca bore with a reserve of strength woven deep in their lineage. Out of it came a boy, vigorous and whole, seemingly untouched by deformity or frailty. For one fleeting span of time, relief washed over the sisters. But such mercy was a mirage. Within hours of the birth, before Rebecca could even sit upright, Harwick appeared in the cell door with his son Thomas at his side, carrying with them cases of glinting instruments. They descended on the infant with methodical fervor. Nancy, trapped in her cell close enough to witness but powerless to intervene, felt her blood run cold as she watched the newborn subjected to examinations devised for things, not people. Calipers pressed against the delicate skull from every imaginable angle. His reflexes were provoked with cruel instruments, every twitch charted. Page after page filled in yet another journal, this one bearing the title of Experimental Progeny. And the ordeal did not end there. For 3 interminable days, the baby was handled, measured, and forced through procedures that would have been regarded as inhuman cruelty even by the crude standards of antebellum medicine. Harwick crouched over him like a vulture, gauging distances from brow to chin, recording minute dimensions of facial features, listing responses to stimuli, and inventing terms like cognitive markers and behavioral irregularities, phantoms only he could perceive. At the close of the 3rd day, when the infant had endured more indignities than any grown man should suffer, Harwick rendered his conclusion. His tone was unshaken, detached, the dispassionate recital of a scientist closing an experiment, as though what lay before him were not a living child, but a test result scrawled into his ledger. The infant, Harwick declared, exhibited what he described as abnormal enlargement of the skull and unsettling hints of cognitive ability that flew in the face of his carefully constructed claims about the mental limitations of the African race. In his warped reasoning, these qualities were not miracles to celebrate, but defects to be erased, traits that endangered both his research agenda and the greater objective of the breeding initiative. With icy detachment, he pronounced the child a scientific irregularity, an outlier that must be destroyed in order to preserve the purity of his results. Intelligence in this newborn was not a gift, it was dangerous, because it exposed the fraud at the very heart of his so-called science. The very evidence of the boy's mind was enough, in Harwick's eyes, to constitute a threat to the ideological foundation of the project itself. That evening, Nancy lay awake within her barred cell as Rebecca's screams ripped through the corridors of the research wing. They came in waves, pleas, shrieks, and sobs, stretching far into the night, until finally they ebbed into a hollow silence broken only by the low, inconsolable weeping of a mother robbed of her child. When dawn finally cracked, Nancy looked across the dim hall and saw her sister collapsed on her bed, unmoving, as lifeless in her grief as a doll abandoned in the dust. Rebecca's eyes were vacant, staring fixedly at nothing, and her hands curled around empty air where her baby had been. Later that day, when Nancy dared to ask what had become of the infant, Harwick gave his explanation with the same cool precision he applied to his notes. He claimed the boy had been weak from birth and had perished naturally before sunrise, yet every syllable betrayed a hidden smugness, as though nature's hand had been quietly guided. Nancy remembered well the slim glass vial she had glimpsed clutched in his fingers as he entered Rebecca's chamber the night before, the same clear liquid that Cartwright had once displayed for him, or its deadly properties. There was no doubt in her mind, Rebecca's child had not died of weakness. He had been silenced because within them sloshed liquids glimmering in shades from water clear to golden amber to a thick blood-colored red. Each bore tiny handwritten labels, coded symbols that carried a menace beyond her understanding, yet sent every instinct in her body recoiling. These preparations, Cartwright explained smoothly, holding one flask up to the shaft of sunlight cutting through the lone window, have proven most effective in Richmond. Administered sparingly in the drinking water of expectant females, they ensure that any developing offspring marked with undesirable qualities will be quietly eliminated through natural termination. He tapped the vial, its liquid sparkling as he tilted it. Another container he lifted higher with a note of pride. This solution of muriatic acid is especially reliable. Applied to the eyes, it produces irreversible blindness while preserving the subject's body for labor. Useful, too, for impressing lessons upon the rest. Nancy's hands trembled where they balanced the tray. Her terror magnified as she realized Harwick was scribbling every detail of dosage and application into his ledger, setting stone upon stone in the edifice of his monstrous project. She overheard, too, the casual remark about marking those deemed disobedient. A searing burn etched into their flesh by acid, branding them permanently. But the darkest revelation was still to come. Their unhesitating acceptance of the necessary disposal of infants. To these men, the murder of newborn children was nothing but a clinical adjustment in an experiment, disguised beneath the cold phrase of natural mortality and excused by theories twisted into weapons. The meeting drew to a close with Dr. Cartwright sliding across the table, a thick envelope, its flap sealed with wax and stamped by insignias Nancy could not decipher from her hiding place. "The Confederate Scientific Commission has expressed said great satisfaction with your preliminary findings," Cartwright intoned, his words weighted with the authority of state approval. "Advance the breeding initiative exactly as outlined in these directives. And remember, absolute discretion is imperative. What is happening here will serve as the bedrock of our cause when the inevitable clash with the North ignites. The data we gather will silence every doubt. It will prove unmistakably that the Negro is unfitted for self-rule, and that slavery is not merely an economic institution, but a moral necessity." With that chilling decree echoing in her mind, Nancy stole away into the gathering dusk, racing back toward the slave quarters, her thoughts colliding in chaos. That night, crammed into the suffocating space of their shared cabin, she confided everything to her sisters. Rebecca, Sarah, Martha, and Nancy huddled together, piecing the horror into a single picture. They were not simply enslaved laborers condemned to toil in the fields. They had become subjects in a grotesque laboratory, part of a systematic breeding scheme designed to prove racial inferiority and enshrine the bondage of their people for generations to follow. In the weeks that came after, Nancy studied her surroundings with sharpened awareness. What once seemed unremarkable now revealed sinister patterns. Certain enslaved women were being fed specialized diets rich in foods denied to the rest, meats, grains, and fresh vegetables, placed in quarters refurbished with better airflow and a cleanliness designed not for comfort, but for controlled observation. Male slaves were stripped, weighed, measured, and prodded in examinations that bore no relation to their field tasks. Worst of all, Nancy noticed the quiet disappearance of infants. Women who had given birth returned childless, their anguished questions deflected with hollow words about frailty, divine judgment, or nature's way. Yet to Nancy, who had overheard the truth, every excuse rang with the stench of murder disguised as science. The edges of the surviving manuscript bear annotations in a hand quite unlike the original, scrawled years later by someone who clearly had access to hidden knowledge. In those marginal notes, the truth is laid bare. The poisonings were deliberate. The wells had been infiltrated with plant-derived toxins. Survival under exposure was thought to stretch no longer than 6 days. Before drawing back the shroud on the saga of Nancy Green and the grim revelations at Harwick Plantation, pause for a moment, subscribe to our channel, and share with us what corner of the country you're listening from. Now let us dig into the past and pull to light one of Virginia's most ruthlessly concealed histories. But to comprehend Nancy Green's dreadful vengeance, we must first return to the beginning, to that soil, those fields, where human beings were stripped of humanity and reduced to test subjects in the name of so-called science. The Rappahannock River Valley in the year 1852 was still a kingdom of tobacco. Plantations thrived, built on smoke, sweat, and human misery. Yet within the private parlors of Richmond's exclusive clubs, conversation was shifting. The Confederacy had not yet been born, but already its elite thinkers, and I use thinkers with irony, were enthralled with racial dogma dressed up in the trappings of science. In lecture halls and imported journals they paraded their obsession to prove with calipers and chemicals what prejudice had already decreed, that slavery was not merely an enterprise, but a civilizing mission ordained by nature. These men, educated at the South's most prestigious schools, believed themselves discoverers of eternal law, when in fact they were architects of cruelty cloaked in pseudoscience. Into this heady, poisonous climate stepped Dr. Edmund Harwick. He inherited his father's estate at a moment when others were content to squeeze profit from field and flesh. But Harwick's vision was darker. He transformed the plantation into something neither his forefathers nor his neighbors could have fathomed. Harwick Plantation stretched over 3,000 acres of Virginia's most fertile land, tilled by the backs of nearly 200 enslaved men, women, and children. For any passerby, an image of wealth gleamed in the morning sun, a proud mansion with high white columns, verandas that looked out over ornamental gardens, orderly slave quarters painted white to impress visitors, and endless horizons knitted together by furrows of tobacco. Yet behind this mask of prosperity, in barns once used to cure leaves, Harwick built an arsenal of horrors. He refitted old structures into laboratories, filling them with imported instruments, glassware, chemical mixtures and powders catalogued from northern and mid-Atlantic suppliers. From the outside, they still resembled common barns. Inside, however, they cradled one of the first large-scale infrastructures for calculated human experimentation, an evil foreshadowing the atrocities of centuries yet to come. Nancy Green's path to Harwick crossed in the spring of 1850. She did not come alone. 3 sisters, Rebecca, Sarah, and Martha, were sold alongside her. They came from Alamance County in North Carolina, casualties of William Patterson's financial ruin. Patterson, desperate, referred to the sisters as troublesome stock, enslaved women capable of reading and writing in defiance of the law. Nancy herself was a woman of striking presence, 22 years in age, tall, dignified even under chains, with intelligent eyes that surveyed everything around her. What she could not know was how little her skill with a hoe or spindle mattered here. She and her sisters were not acquired for labor in the fields, but for something more chilling, the role they would play in Harwick's experiments. Harwick, a proud graduate of the Medical College of Virginia and a corresponding member of the American School of Anthropology, had become feverishly consumed with the writings of Samuel Morton, the man whose skull measurements claimed to demonstrate hierarchies among races. Obsessed with Morton's conclusions, Harwick sought not only to echo them, but to take them further, pressing human lives into the mold of his macabre science. Morton's conclusions pointed directly to what he framed as proof of the supposed inferiority of people of African descent. His studies created the illusion of a scientific rationale for the continuation of slavery. But Edmund Harwick was not satisfied with merely citing someone else's findings. He dreamed of pushing further. In his mind, deliberate control over reproduction and the manipulation of living conditions would allow him to craft undeniable evidence of racial hierarchy, evidence that he believed could anchor the Southern cause for generations and permanently silence the protests of Northern abolitionists. The Harwick household itself was a troubling portrait of this obsession. At its head stood Dr. Edmund Harwick, 43 years old, hollowed out by ambition, consumed by his hunger for recognition as a man of science. At his side was Cordelia, his wife, a Charleston belle who had seized upon her husband's theories as though they were gospel, championing his every cruel design. Their sons, Thomas and William, aged 17 and 15, had been raised in the shadow of their father's ideology, drilled from childhood to see enslaved people not as neighbors or fellow human beings, but as specimens, bodies to catalogue, not lives to honor. The youngest, Margaret, was only 13, but her words and gestures already hinted at the same casual brutality that defined her family. The elder patriarch, Colonel Jeremiah Harwick, a grey veteran of the War of 1812, offered up both the prestige of his name and the weight of his fortune to underwrite his son's grotesque pursuits. And finally there was Captain James Harwick, the younger brother, who acted as overseer, enforcing a system of ruthless discipline necessary to keep the breeding program running as designed. To outsiders, this family appeared respectable. Pillars of their community who dressed well for Sunday Episcopal services, made visible charitable contributions, and extended warm Southern hospitality to the powerful guests who crossed their threshold. Yet to Nancy Green and the others bound to them in chains, these people embodied the machinery of nightmare. They became architects of suffering so profound it mocked every human virtue, perpetrators of crimes that trampled the very essence of decency, all in service to theories as false as they were barbaric. Nancy began her life at Harwick Plantation in the great house itself. Assigned duties within the mansion, she quickly caught the eye and eventually the wary admiration of Cordelia Harwick. Her gifts were unmistakable. Literacy in reading and writing, as well as a practiced knowledge of herbal remedies and healing traditions, passed down through her family line, women who had long served as midwives and healers on North Carolina plantations. Yet Nancy had no way of knowing that another set of eyes was following her as well. Dr. Harwick himself kept her under constant watch, recording her stature, her wit, her mannerisms into a cracked leather ledger. With strokes of his pen, he reduced her to notations and diagrams, her humanity stripped away until she became subject one in his grand experiment, flesh turned to data, life broken down into entries for a pseudo-scientific catalogue. It was a heavy August morning in the summer of 1851 when Nancy first caught a glimpse of the true nature of her imprisonment. The Virginia heat pressed down like a smothering curtain, the air pungent with drying tobacco leaves, and the bee, it a scent of hopelessness that seemed to cling to the slave quarters. She had been dispatched to bring food, cold chicken, floured biscuits. The machinery of Harwick's nightmare accelerated in the autumn of 1851, just as Virginia's hills flared in radiant scarlets and golds, a cruel counterpoint to the darkness consuming the plantation. Nancy and her sisters were forcibly relocated into a section of quarters repurposed by Harwick and chillingly renamed the research facility. Everyone knew what it truly was, a prison finely tuned to serve experimental needs. Once a tobacco warehouse, the building had been sectioned into narrow cells, each no more than 8 feet by 10. Each chamber contained a single cot, a chipped basin, and a tiny window barred with iron so no escape could be attempted. The walls smothered sound, and every thick oak door locked tight from the outside. On the outer walls hung charts meticulously noting each captive's physical attributes, their breeding assignments, and their place in the experimental program. Nancy was chosen first. The protocol began with her. She was paired with a man named Samuel, a field hand recently purchased from Henrico County. Dr. Harwick's notes described him in clinical fashion, a body-judged strong specimen with what the doctor dismissed as limited cranial aptitude. To Harwick, Samuel represented precisely what he sought. A man with brawn to pass along, but without the intelligence he feared might complicate his theories. To Nancy, though, he was not data or specimen. He was a fellow prisoner, thrust like her into the iron machinery of Harwick's perverse design. Those traits, Harwick declared, were flaws that must be bred out of succeeding generations. Samuel, however, stood in stark contrast to the cruel description placed upon him. Though his stature was broad and his body marked by strength, his spirit was gentle, and like Nancy, he recoiled inwardly when the true purpose of their forced union was laid bare. When Dr. Harwick explained the so-called bear-eating procedure, his words carried the cold neutrality of a physician lecturing on anatomy rather than a man dictating the lives of human beings. Both Samuel and Nancy grasped immediately that refusal would mean swift torment or execution. Yet they also understood that compliance offered no promise, that even if children were conceived, their survival was far from assured. Every aspect of their captivity was manipulated under strict guidelines Harwick had pieced together through his correspondence with men of similar mind across the South. Their meals were rationed and adjusted, with added powders and tinctures the doctor insisted would shape the nature of their unborn. But Nancy's instincts whispered that these mixtures were not protections but poisons, that they themselves were subjects to be studied, not cared for. Each week they endured examinations that cut away at dignity, Harwick weighing, probing and measuring them like livestock. Their arms were pricked for blood, their frames assessed with meticulous notes, each detail etched into those familiar leather journals that seemed to multiply without end. The darkness sharpened when Rebecca, Nancy's sister, conceived a child with her assigned partner Joshua, a soft-spoken man whose fate had been sealed by the same cruel criteria that selected Samuel. Harwick's anticipation now burned openly. He visited Rebecca's confinement daily, scrutinizing every change with obsessive precision. He measured the swell of her belly, tested her reactions, conducted procedures under the guise of maternal care, but all structured as experiments cloaked in medical language. Each act revealed itself as less about her well-being and more about data. When the child arrived in spring of 1852, Nancy allowed herself a fragile breath of hope. At last, perhaps, the torment might cease. Perhaps the child would be permitted to breathe free, lie among the enslaved community, to grow in spite of chains, as yet untouched by the monstrous calculations of science. The delivery was long and grueling. He was too intelligent, too human for the twisted theories Harwick sought to preserve. His very existence shattered the breeding program's foundation, so he was killed to protect a lie. In the wake of this horror, Nancy's chance to gather information arrived through the duty that had once singled her out, her assignment to tidy and maintain Harwick's private study, where once it had seemed a mere chore, it became a tactical advantage, for in those hours of polishing and straightening, she gained unparalleled insight into the machinery of his so-called research. The once innocuous tobacco barn had been reshaped into a laboratory that could have drawn admiration even from visiting physicians in Richmond or Baltimore. Rows of shelving sagged beneath glass containers filled with strange chemical brews. On every table lay diagrams, charts, and records tracking the progress of his captive subjects. And scattered among it all was a steady correspondence with distant colleagues, letters that hinted at a sprawling web of similar facilities stretching across the southern states. Nancy approached her tasks meticulously, dusting, washing, and arranging while secretly fixating on every object and location. She trained herself to memorize the position of each vessel. Slowly she began mapping the laboratory in her thoughts, cataloging the strange arsenal of chemistry that Harwick wielded. She quickly learned to recognize the distinctive bottles of muriatic acid, the ones tinted in brownish amber glass, their contents so volatile that even a sealed stopper could not hold the faint noxious fumes from leaking. She also identified the smaller, paler flasks kept near Harwick's desk, the same deadly fluid Cartwright himself had flaunted, now stored within easy reach. Each was marked with cryptic symbols, arcane notations that Nancy began to interpret by relentless observation and cautious deduction. More chilling than the chemicals, however, were the books. Harwick's collection of journals sprawled across shelves and drawers, each bound in dark leather, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, she found not only meticulous records of every forced union and every measurement taken of enslaved bodies, but also detailed formulas for mixing and administering compounds, patterns of correspondence with collaborators, and, worst of all, exact entries of infant killings. Cold, clinical evidence of murder masquerading as scientific research. These pages revealed to her the vastness of the nightmare. The atrocity had spread far beyond Harwick's land. His plantation was one node in a network of hidden laboratories, each contributing to a larger campaign that cloaked genocide in the hollow authority of science. Harwick's work was never an isolated endeavor. He belonged to a carefully structured alliance of plantation masters and medical men who, across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, carried out parallel breeding experiments with chilling coordination. Their shared goal was singular and sinister: to manufacture scientific evidence that could uphold the South's dogma of racial superiority once the unavoidable clash with the North erupted, crafting an intellectual facade for slavery meant to silence abolitionist insistence on equality. As Nancy pored over the journals and papers, she discovered records chronicling the deliberate killing of infant after infant, dozens of babies targeted for possessing traits deemed undesirable. The crimes were described in blunt clinical language: children whose signs of unusual intelligence, advanced coordination, or vivid emotional expression marked them as threats rather than miracles. Those lives were erased in the name of data. She uncovered the true nature of the clear liquid she had once seen Cartwright flaunt. It was no mysterious elixir, but a distilled mixture of lethal plant toxins extracted from pokeweed, oleander leaves, and castor beans, capable of ending life within hours. Worst of all, the poison left behind no obvious marks, no telltale signs to alert local doctors, authorities, or the enslaved themselves. Death came quietly, able to be passed off as illness or divine will. Nancy also confirmed her suspicions about the brown-hued bottles of muriatic acid. Yes, they were used as marks of punishment, burning scars into skin for problem slaves. But Harwick's notes revealed that this was merely the beginning of his experimentation. He had carefully tested varying strengths, refining techniques that could cause injuries ranging from mild surface burns to horrific disfigurements, even absolute blindness. Each grisly outcome was catalogued with the dispassionate tone of a researcher charting the effectiveness of a medical cure. Among the most damning evidence was a freshly delivered letter from Samuel Cartwright himself. In its opening, he praised Harwick for his innovative strategies in controlling his subject population and applauded the success he had achieved in eradicating what they chillingly referred to as cognitive anomalies. But the letter did more than congratulate. It introduced directions for a new invention, a chemical mixture tailored to punish any enslaved person who showed too much visual intelligence, the ability to observe and interpret the world keenly, to read danger, to strategize escape. Such awareness, the letter warned, imperiled the secrecy of their operation. The formula prescribed a brutal compound, a blend of concentrated lye and muriatic acid, designed to dissolve corneas and sever the optic nerves, robbing vision permanently while leaving the body intact. Victims would live on in blindness, their suffering weaponized as a warning to others. As the instructions were precise, the solution was to be dropped directly into the eyes as the subject was restrained, ensuring the poison would saturate every part of the ocular tissue. Nancy's stomach churned as she deciphered these directives, rage mounting step by step with her fear. Yet within her horror, a fierce realization formed. All of these toxins, all of these corrosive brews, intended to strip her people of dignity and sight, could be redirected. With careful calculation, the very tools Harwick and Cartwright had wielded against the enslaved could instead become instruments of their undoing. But vengeance was not the sum of her vision. Nancy's plan was grander and far more dangerous. She intended to bring light upon the entire hidden network, to reveal every plantation in league with Harwick, to ensure that no other mother, no other child, no other family would be condemned to this machinery of cruelty. Even if the cost was her own life, she would not allow their secrets to remain in the shadows. Silent and determined, she began copying crucial details whenever she cleaned Harwick's study. Where once she dusted, now she spied. Where once she organized, now she stole words and knowledge. On scraps of stray paper, hidden in corners, slipped under boards, she transcribed the names of fellow conspirators, the addresses of plantations, the names of government men and respectable citizens who backed the scheme. Most critically, she committed to memory the recipes, measurements, and directions for every chemical compound, until she carried within her the very weaponry of Harwick's arsenal. Her own body told her time was running short. Her pregnancy was nearing its conclusion. Barely a month remained. With growing certainty, she understood that when her child was born, he or she would be surrendered to the same merciless machinery Rebecca's child had faced. The knowledge galvanized her resolve. Whatever days she had left, they would not be wasted. If Nancy's infant displayed even the faintest spark of intelligence, physical ability, or awareness that clashed with Dr. Harwick's twisted theories, she knew the outcome. The child would be condemned just as her sister's babies had been. The weight of that certainty fueled her, rage swelling each day within her, binding desperation with an unshakable resolve. She swore that before long the Harwick family would answer for their crimes. Yet within the doctor's papers she uncovered something that deepened her urgency, a revelation that transformed her mission from personal vengeance into something larger. Hidden among his records was documentation proving that Harwick's program was about to grow far beyond its current scale. Financial support and authorization had been secured from Confederate allies in Richmond, enabling him to expand his operations from roughly 200 enslaved test subjects to more than 1,000. Harwick Plantation would soon become nothing less than the South's greatest experimental compound, an empire of cruelty under the guise of scientific inquiry. Construction already pressed forward on neighboring properties, where new buildings rose like scars against the earth. Fresh victims were being acquired from slave markets across Virginia and the Carolinas, brought in with the cold intention of forming a massive racial database, a grotesque catalog intended to give the Confederacy intellectual ammunition and political justification on the battlefield of ideas. What Nancy and her sisters had endured, the systematic theft of children, the coldly documented murders already committed, was poised to be reproduced on an industrial scale. More mothers would suffer. More infants would vanish. Time for quiet watching and patience was finished. The hour had come for action, however steep the cost, however slim the chances of survival might be. On a February morning in 1853, Nancy's labor began. A storm raged against the walls of the facility, wind shrieking like a chorus of grief, while sleet and ice clung to the barred windows of their converted barn. Her sister Sarah acted as midwife in the frigid cell, murmuring strength through the endless hours of pain. The ordeal stretched through the night, but as dawn finally broke, Nancy found herself cradling a miracle, a daughter, beautiful, whole, her tiny body warm against Nancy's arms. But this joy was poisoned with dread, for Nancy saw immediately what her heart already feared. The newborn's gaze was bright and alert, her movements responsive and strong. Every reaction, every flicker of awareness in her searching eyes echoed the traits already deemed dangerous within Harwick's system, the very qualities that had earned other children termination. She was radiant in her life, and yet that vitality itself was a death sentence under the doctor's monstrous rubric. For 18 irreplaceable hours, Nancy cherished her baby. Each breath, each glance became eternity pressed into seconds. She memorized the curve of her daughter's face, held her close until the rhythm of her heartbeat became carved into memory. She tried desperately to pour a lifetime's worth of love, protection, and comfort into the span of less than a day, because she knew what waited beyond. When Harwick entered at last, carrying his instruments and ledger, he did not come alone. His two sons, Thomas and William, shadowed him, trained apprentices in this machinery of cruelty. Nancy, her arms trembling, was forced to surrender her child into the hands of the man who had already condemned countless innocents. Her soul cracked as she let go, understanding that she was likely handing her baby to death. The evaluation was merciless. Instruments pinched and measured her daughter's tiny skull, calipers pressed against delicate temples. Sharp tools probed reflexes. Every movement, every sound from the infant was scrutinized while the doctor dictated each data point in precise tones. Thomas bent dutifully over a leather-bound journal, recording entry after entry, reducing the living, breathing child into numbers and terminology. The examination stretched on endlessly, Nancy straining to swallow every cry from her cell, her body aching with helplessness. At long last, the procedure ended after what felt like hours of prodding and lifeless documentation. And then, Harwick delivered his verdict. Spoken as dispassionately as a lab report, it was damning. Inevitable. The child, he declared, showed irregular enlargement of the cranium. Harwick's final judgment was chilling in its precision. He recorded that the infant demonstrated abnormal patterns of cranial growth, heightened sensitivity to visual cues, and, most damning of all in his eyes, unmistakable signs of advanced cognition. These traits, he insisted, contradicted his assertions about the supposed mental limitations inherent to the black race. Dictating his findings in a detached monotone, he described the child as a serious deviation from expected racial norms and declared her unfit for the continuation of the controlled bloodline. The execution, he decreed, would take place the following morning. The method was predetermined, the same plant-based concoctions already used to end the lives of Nancy's nephews. In Harwick's words, the baby was to be administered a carefully calibrated dose of toxin that would trigger rapid collapse of the organs while simulating natural weakness. The report would list the death with cold finality as infant mortality, an event tragically common enough to pass unchallenged. Her body, like the others before her, would be hidden in the outlying fields of the plantation, anonymously placed in unmarked earth where no outside scrutiny would ever follow. That night, Nancy sat in the darkness, her daughter breathing softly against her chest. As she cradled the child fat, to die before drawing another day's dawn, her rage crystallized into purpose. Every piece of the plan she had been shaping for months now aligned with grim clarity. She had memorized the location of each vial in Harwick's laboratory, noted the daily habits of his household, and quietly collected the implements she needed to strike with accuracy and force. This, however, was not to be blind vengeance born of grief, though grief burned through her veins. Nancy's intention stretched further. She meant not only to punish the Harwicks, but to expose the entire machine of horror they had constructed. She would ensure that their documents, journals, and letters, proof of systematic infanticide disguised as research, were preserved and conveyed to those who might act. She knew abolitionist allies in Richmond and even Washington, men and women already angered by the cruelty of slavery, would be horrified to learn that plantations across the South had been turned into secret laboratories of death. If she could live long enough to leak what she had gathered, then perhaps others, mothers, children, entire families, might be saved from suffering the fate her own had endured. Her design required flawless execution, timing, precision, composure, all the skill of a general planning a campaign. She would need to incapacitate every member of the Harwick family bound up in the program, preserve the incriminating journals and formulae, and create a spectacle so undeniable that outside authorities would be compelled to investigate. The same chemical arsenal Harwick had intended as tools of agony and control would now, in Nancy's hands, become the instruments of retribution. And unlike Harwick's detached cruelty, hers would not be neat, quick, or merciful. She intended to make them feel every thorn of helplessness, every tremor of terror, every ounce of degradation they had inflicted on this whose they tormented. As midnight deepened and the storm battered the walls with a sound like cannon fire, Nancy pressed her lips gently to her daughter's tiny brow. She placed the child into Sarah's waiting arms and whispered with a fierceness barely audible over the roar of wind, "Whatever happens to me, protect her, carry her away from this place if you can, and one day tell her the truth, that her mother stood against monsters, and that she must never forget she is worth more than every cruel theory or measurement written in their books." Then, with heart steeled, Nancy slipped quietly from her cramped cell. She had long ago studied the lock that kept her prisoner and, through patience and clever hands, learned how to counter its mechanism. Now, at last, she put that knowledge to use. The chains of confinement fell open, and she stepped into the night, ready to turn Harwick's own science into the weapon that would destroy him. The plantation lay under a heavy hush, broken only by the storm's fading wrath and the timeless chorus of Virginia's night, crickets, frogs, and branches shifting in the winter wind. Even the dogs kept at the edge of the grounds ignored her passing, their recognition of her scent sparing her from discovery as she slipped steadily toward the mansion's outbuildings. There, in the repurposed tobacco barn that housed Harwick's instruments of cruelty, awaited the very tools she meant to turn back upon their creators. The laboratory was locked with a thick iron pad and chain, a barrier that would have defeated almost anyone else, but years of cleaning duty had offered Nancy patient instruction in how the space was secured. Again and again she had watched Harwick's hands perform the ritual of locking and unlocking, every detail etched into her mind. She knew as well where he had hidden the key, inside a wooden box tucked beneath the desk, swaddled in oiled cloth to guard it from damp, and placed in such a way that a missing key would not be noticed until it was far too late. Within moments her fingers closed around it, and the lock yielded to her steady hand. She stepped into the barn that had birthed so much sorrow, now entering as an agent of reckoning rather than a servant. The room pressed its silence around her. Rain dripped faintly from the eaves. The timbers gave their intermittent groans as the cold settled deeper into their joints. Otherwise there was only emptiness and the spectral presence of what had been done here. The shelves were exactly as she remembered them, compounds lined in tidied ranks and tagged with Harwick's meticulous scrawl. On one high shelf stooped the great jar of caustic lye solution, its lettering precise, its placement governed by the sterile protocols Harwick had culled from his network of correspondence. Closer to the desk lay the smaller bottles of muriatic acid, each one dated at the time of its preparation, each carefully sealed as if its orderliness could scrub the stench of murder from the act. Nancy set to her task with steady hands. She measured out portions of both lye and acid, duplicating exactly the instructions Cartwright had once committed to paper. She mimicked the clinical precision of the very man she hated, trusting in memory and careful observation. The fumes threatened to choke her when the compounds met, but she persisted, knowing the necessary precautions, taking every step as deliberately as she had watched him take them dozens of times before. From those dangerous mixtures, she created her weapon, a perfectly clear solution, odorless, innocuous to the eye, yet vicious, capable of stripping vision instantly and forever from anyone it touched. But vengeance meant more than blindness alone. Nancy required that the Harwick family endure, at least long enough to taste dread and to leave behind incriminating evidence no official could ignore. The solution was prepared, not to kill but to unmake them as men and women of authority, to bind them in the very helplessness they had inflicted. 7 vials she made in total, one for every Harwick whose hand, directly or indirectly, had painted suffering upon her people. Each vial was small, exact, crafted with the same delicate tools Harwick once used when formulating his research. She did not stop there. Bottles of other concoctions joined her collection. The plant-derived poisons that had stolen the lives of infants, the corrosive marking fluids used to brand enslaved bodies as things to catalogue. These too would be set aside as part of her arsenal. Yet the most vital piece of her plan was not chemical. It was written. Lying within drawers and atop shelves was Harwick's true archive of monstrosity. The leather-bound journals painstakingly cataloguing every death, every experiment, every arrangement with fellow conspirators across the South. Nancy bundled them carefully, wrapping them in oilcloth to guard against water or decay, then hid them in multiple secure places, ensuring that when discovery came, whether weeks later or decades, nothing would have rotted away. With them, she included a confession of her own authorship, written in her steady hand, outlining both the crimes committed and the perpetrators who profited by them. She named the plantations, the financiers, the physicians, and spelled out where authorities would find proof. Should she fall, her words and his records would stand together, exposing their systematic murder to the wider world. And with the journals secured, the vials prepared, and her resolve tempered like forged steel, she lifted her eyes toward the great house where the Harwicks slept, unaware of the reckoning inching closer with every step Nancy Green took. The house was silent as Nancy drifted from room to room, moving with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years mastering these halls while remaining unseen by their inhabitants. The Harwick family slept soundly in their comfortable beds, unaware, too, that their victim had become their judge, jury, and executioner, and that their world of scientific racism was about to collapse in the most literal and agonizing way imaginable. Nancy's first target was Dr. Harwick himself, the architect of the breeding program, the man who had murdered her nephews and plotted her daughter's death in the name of progress. She found him asleep in his study, surrounded by the books and papers that had fueled the false science behind his crimes, his face serene in rest despite the horrors he had wrought. Nancy stood over him for a long moment, vial of burning solution in hand, thinking of all the children who had perished because of his twisted theories. She whispered a prayer for her dead nephews, for her condemned daughter, for every silenced victim, before applying the chemical drops to his closed eyes with the same clinical care he had once used on infants. His screams as the acid devoured his corneas were enough to wake the entire house. But Nancy had expected this chaos, using the panic and confusion as her cover while family members stumbled blindly through the halls, unable to understand the punishment descending on them. To Nancy, their terror was a symphony of long-delayed justice. One by one, she delivered the solution to each Harwick. Thomas and William, teenage sons who had aided their father's cruel experiments, received theirs while still dazed with sleep. Margaret, the daughter who had watched newborn evaluations with cold detachment, was blinded while fleeing toward her parents' room. Colonel Jeremiah, the aged patriarch who had bankrolled the horrors, was struck while fumbling to load his pistol. Captain James, the overseer who had supervised the murders, was taken while trying to rally defense against what he thought was a slave revolt. And finally, Mrs. Cordelia Harwick, Nancy's last target, received her dose accompanied by a brutal explanation. Her blindness was payment for every child slain, every privilege built upon infanticide. Nancy wanted Cordelia to see her guilt one last time before her sight dissolved into darkness. If this tale chills you, share it with a friend who loves grim mysteries. Strike the like button, subscribe, and never miss stories like this. Together we descend into the abyss of NY's Night of Justice. Yet the blinding of the Harwicks was not the end. It was only the prelude to a slow, agonizing campaign of vengeance. Their screams echoed through the manor as they staggered through rooms they could no longer see, colliding with furniture, crying out in terror, swallowed by the darkness Nancy had delivered. Desperation filled the house as cries for help that would never come faded into the shadows. Nancy set the second phase of her plan in motion. A methodical poisoning that would guarantee slow, agonizing deaths while keeping them alive long enough to endure the full consequences of their actions. The plantation's water came from a deep well behind the main house, hand-dug by enslaved workers decades before and carefully lined with fitted stones to guard against contamination. Nancy had long ago identified that well as the most efficient conduit for the plant-based toxins Dr. Harwick had once used to murder infants. Every sip would carry their sentence. She measured doses of the poisons taken from Harwick's laboratory with the same clinical precision the doctor had favored, following formulations memorized from his journal. The mixture blended pokeweed extracts that would cause progressive organ failure, oleander compounds that would ravage the heart, and castor bean derivatives that would destroy liver and kidneys over days. These toxins were engineered to produce gradual collapse over several days, giving symptoms time to reveal themselves and allowing the victims to witness and comprehend the slow unspooling of their fate. Unlike the swift deaths inflicted upon the infirmate, the Harwick family would endure prolonged suffering, ample moments to contemplate their crimes and the justice of the outcome. Nancy emptied the entire solution into the well, ensuring every drop drawn by the family carried its fatal verdict. The poisons were colorless and nearly tasteless, undetectable until the poisoning advanced beyond any hope of treatment, even if rural Virginia in 1853 had possessed such remedies. NY's plan extended beyond the household to the overseers and guards who had enforced the breeding program and disposed of murdered children. She knew some of those men had innocent families, children who bore no guilt, and she refused to harm the blameless. Yet the adults who had participated in or possessed knowledge of the infanticide would share their employer's fate. The overseer's quarters sat near the main house in a neat row of small buildings housing white employees who ran plantation operations. Nancy moved through them in the pre-dawn dark, visiting each cabin while occupants slept, unaware that retribution had finally arrived. Ferguson, the head overseer who had restrained infants during Harwick's evaluations, received a full dose of the blinding solution as he slept. Nancy had seen him hold down struggling babies while Harwick administered lethal injections, and she showed him no mercy as she destroyed his sight. The stable master, who had helped bury the murdered children in unmarked graves across the estate, was blinded as he tried to rise in response to the main house's screams. Nancy worked with methodical thoroughness, reaching everyone on the plantation with knowledge of or participation in the breeding program. The plantation's clerk, keeper of experimental records and breeding schedules, was blinded in his office amid confusion. The doctor's assistant, a young man from Richmond who aided with examinations and chemical preparati, received his dose while attempting to flee in panic. By dawn, 9 adults had been blinded and the well, the plantation's entire water supply, had been fatally contaminated. Nancy had achieved her primary mission with relentless precision, guaranteeing that every individual tied to the breeding program would face the ultimate price for their atrocities while leaving behind undeniable proof to expose the vast network of experimental plantations. As dawn broke over Harwick Plantation, stretching long shadows across the tobacco fields and illuminating the grim tableau of justice delivered, Nancy returned to the research facility where her daughter and sisters waited. She understood that discovery by the authorities was inevitable, and that her own death could not be avoided. Yet she had fulfilled all that she intended. The Harwick family would endure slow, excruciating deaths, tasting only a fraction of the torment they had inflicted upon countless innocents. More crucially, their crimes would be unearthed, and the breeding program revealed to the wider world. Nancy devoted her final hours of freedom to writing meticulous letters to abolitionists in Richmond and Washington, describing the exact location of Dr. Harwick's records and naming other plantations conducting similar experiments. She also drafted a comprehensive confession detailing her actions, her reasoning, and the necessity of her campaign, ensuring that investigators of the future would grasp the full scale of the horrors at Harwick Plantation and the desperate steps required to end them. These letters were hidden in numerous places around the estate, sealed in oiled cloth and secured where they would be found during the inquiries certain to come. Nancy also composed detailed instructions for her sisters, encoded with a system she taught them in those final hours, so they could locate and deliver the evidence if any of them managed to survive the brutal retaliation that was sure to follow. The first sign of disaster at Harwick Plantation emerged when Dr. Edmund Harwick failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with Richmond officials on March 15, 1853. He had been expected to present new findings to a committee of Confederate sympathizers eager to exploit his work in support of theories of racial inferiority. His unexplained absence from such a pivotal gathering was uncharacteristic for a man whose reputation rested on professional reliability and scientific discipline. When Harwick's colleague, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, arrived at the plantation with two prominent Richmond financiers of the program, they encountered a nightmare that would remain with them forever. The main house resounded with the cries and groans of the blinded Harwick family, staggering helplessly through rooms they could no longer navigate while succumbing to the slow destruction of their organs from systemic poisoning. At first, Dr. Cartwright assumed some tragic industrial mishap had occurred, perhaps a chemical accident during tobacco processing or contamination of the water supply by natural causes. But closer examination of the victims, guided by the clinical expertise that made him one of the South's leading physicians, revealed otherwise. The uniform blindness afflicting every victim pointed to the intentional use of a precise chemical solution rather than accidental exposure. Meanwhile, the symptoms of poisoning betrayed sustained ingestion of multiple plant-based toxins, requiring advanced knowledge of chemistry and botany to prepare and administer. It was evident that someone had deliberately blinded the Harwick family and methodically poisoned the plantation's well with lethal compounds designed for slow, irreversible damage. The extraordinary precision of the assault implied an education and scientific mastery that contradicted the prevailing belief in the ignorance of enslaved people. The investigation that followed exposed the full scope of NY's vengeance, and more importantly, the vast machinery of systematic infanticide that had provoked it, stood exposed. Dr. Cartwright, though deeply complicit in the breeding program and a chief architect of the theories that had legitimized it, was nevertheless horrified by the overwhelming evidence of mass murder that NY's retaliation had brought to light. The meticulous records preserved in Dr. Harwick's laboratory revealed a vision of scientific cruelty far exceeding anything even the most devoted Confederate sympathizers could explain or excuse. The organized slaughter of infants, the exploitation of enslaved people as experimental material, and the interconnected web of cooperation with other facilities throughout the South unveiled a system of cruelty so calculated that it shook even men who had spent their lives defending slavery. Authorities were summoned from Richmond, but their inquiry immediately collided with the explosive political implications of the case. The breeding program had entangled influential families across Virginia and carried the backing of Confederate officials who intended to wield its findings as justification for secession and the spread of slavery into new territories. A full investigation risked exposing a network that reached into the highest levels of Southern power and threatened to destabilize the Confederate project before it had even begun. Nancy herself was located within the research building, seated calmly beside her infant daughter and her sisters, awaiting the certain consequences of her deeds. When interrogated about the Harwick family's blinding and poisoning, she delivered a thorough confession, citing precise locations of documents and naming other collaborators in the program across the region. Her written testimony, crafted in clear and educated prose that startled investigators expecting an illiterate field hand, laid bare years of systematic infanticide masquerading as scientific advancement. She supplied exact descriptions of the methods by which infants were killed, the burial sites where their bodies had been discarded, and the communication channels that bound experimental plantations in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina into a coordinated network. The Virginia authorities now faced an impossible dilemma, one that overturned their most basic assumptions about law, order, and justice. By statute, Nancy had committed multiple acts of assault and attempted murder, offenses normally punished with immediate execution under Virginia law. Yet her victims were perpetrators of atrocities so grotesque that even in antebellum Virginia, where brutality against the enslaved was routine and rarely punished, the systematic murder of babies crossed boundaries too horrific to ignore. Even defenders of slavery balked at the deliberate extermination of infants, finding it indefensible both legally and morally. The use of enslaved people as human test subjects in pseudoscientific experiments compounded the outrage, particularly when it involved intentional child killings. The political stakes were even greater. Nancy's evidence implicated not only the Harwicks, but also dozens of powerful families and exposed a lattice of experimental sites across several states, operating with the knowledge and tacit support of men poised to lead the Confederacy itself. The Harwick family's final agony unfolded over 6 drawn-out days, as Dr. Cartwright and other physicians attempted treatment while privately recoiling at the horrors revealed. The botanical poisons Nancy had selected were designed precisely for lethality and resistance to remedy, rendering medical intervention nearly useless, even with the most advanced knowledge available in 1853. Edmund Harwick was the first to die, his body collapsing under the weight of cascading organ failures, while his ruined eyes leaked blood and pus that soaked his pillows and stained the linens beneath his head. His final hours passed in delirium, crying out the names of the children he had slaughtered and begging forgiveness from voices that could never answer him. His last words, preserved by Dr. Cartwright in a report sealed for more than a century, were both a confession and an admission that NY's vengeance had been deserved. "She did what any mother would do," he whispered through cracked, swollen lips that barely managed to shape the words. "God forgive us for what we became in the name of science. The children, all those innocent children, they deserved more than what we gave them." The remaining family members followed over the days that came, each death slower, harsher, more agonizing than the last, as the toxins consumed their organs piece by piece. While consciousness lingered, the teenage sons, Thomas and William, spent their last hours calling weakly for their mother, unaware she too was dying in the next room, their voices fading as the poison tore through their young frames. Margaret, the youngest daughter, resisted the longest. Her strong constitution prolonged her suffering, forcing her to endure the complete horror of her family's unraveling. Her last words were a plea for Nancy to spare her life, a desperate acknowledgement that the enslaved woman now held the power of life and death over the family that had once claimed to own her. Colonel Jeremiah Harwick, the aged patriarch and financier of the breeding program, slipped into blind delirium in his final days, barking orders to soldiers long dead and reliving battles of the War of 1812 as his body failed. Captain James Harwick, the overseer who had overseen the program, perished cursing NY's name, but Saidiantia, till conceding the justice of his fate. Mrs. Cordelia Harwick lingered among the last, her aristocratic strength stretching her agony, while she watched every belief she held about race and social order disintegrate. In her last hours, she summoned Nancy to her bedside, begging forgiveness for the crimes committed by her family. Whether this was true repentance or only terror of divine judgment was never clear. Nancy observed these deaths from her confinement in the research facility, holding her daughter close, waiting for her own execution, her heart filled with a storm of sorrow, grim determination, and grim satisfaction. She had achieved what she had sworn to do. The Harwick family had endured only a fragment of the torment they had inflicted on others. The evidence of their atrocities had been preserved, the truth of the breeding program laid bare for the world. Virginia's authorities, facing unbearable political consequences, concluded that a public trial could never be risked. Such proceedings would expose the entire lattice of experimental plantations spread across the South. The slaughter of enslaved infants was already impossible to defend, but the entanglement of powerful families and government officials in scientific butchery rendered the matter politically incendiary, threatening the stability of Southern society itself. Instead, arrangements were made for Nancy's quiet transfer to a remote facility, where she would be held indefinitely, away from abolitionists and journalists who might seize her case as proof to condemn slavery and reveal the network of breeding programs. Official records would later claim she died in custody of natural causes. The truth, however, was far more complex and morally fraught, yet Nancy had foreseen this outcome and prepared for it with the same relentless planning that had guided her vengeance against the Harwick family. Before her relocation, she succeeded in passing her carefully composed letters to Underground Railroad conductors who guaranteed their delivery to well-known abolitionists across the North and into Canada. Within a short span after her disappearance from Virginia, thorough reports of the Harwick Harwick breeding program were appearing in abolitionist newspapers throughout New England, complete with passages from Dr. Harwick's journals and testimonies from enslaved survivors of the experiments. The political consequences were immediate and devastating for Confederate supporters who had hoped to employ scientific racism as justification for their cause and to rally moderate Northerners to the idea of secession. The revelation of the Harwick breeding program sent tremors throughout the hidden network of experimental plantations operating in secrecy across the South. As accomplices grasped that their activities were no longer shielded from public exposure, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, confronted with undeniable proof of systematic infanticide that his theories had inspired and legitimized, suffered a total mental collapse and spent his last years confined in an asylum near Richmond, haunted by the specters of murdered children and the relentless justice Nancy Green had carried out. Other conspirators in the breeding program network met different ends as the scandal engulfed Southern society. Some fled into remote regions of Texas or Arkansas, hoping to evade the political backlash from Nancy's revelations and to continue their work under greater secrecy. Others scrambled to erase all traces of their involvement, burning documents and silencing witnesses in desperate efforts to escape the fate of the Harwick family. Yet Nancy's painstaking records had preserved sufficient proof to identify most members of the network, and her deliberate placement of evidence guaranteed that investigators could trace links between sites even when specific files had been destroyed. The deliberate structure of her planning ensured that uncovering one facility would inevitably reveal others, triggering a chain of exposures that ultimately dismantled the entire system. The plantation itself was abandoned immediately following the Harwick family's deaths, as local people, horrified by the revelations of the breeding program, refused either to cultivate the land or to purchase the estate. Within months, the main house had been looted of all valuables by thieves who cared nothing for the suffering that had taken place there, and the research complex had been burned to the ground by unknown hands determined to erase any remaining physical proof of the experiments. Despite attempts by political authorities to suppress records of Nancy's case, the Virginia State Archives preserved enough material to give future historians a detailed account of both the breeding program and Nancy's calculated vengeance. These documents, sealed for more than a century and only recently released to scholars, expose the vast scope of scientific racism preceding the Civil War and the desperate actions enslaved people sometimes took to safeguard their families and reveal the truth. Nancy Green's tale grew into a whispered legend within enslaved communities across the South, passed on through oral tradition and carefully hidden from slaveholders who would have sought to stifle its spread. The account of a woman who single-handedly annihilated an entire family of slaveholders became both an inspiration and a warning. Inspiration for those who dreamed of defiance and justice, and warning of the terrible cost that resistance exacted upon the courageous who dared to attempt it. The broader political effect of Nancy's actions reached far beyond Virginia, feeding heavily into the escalating friction between North and South that would soon erupt into the Civil War. The disclosure that Confederate sympathizers had conducted organized experiments on enslaved people, including the killing of children, armed Northern politicians with powerful arguments against the expansion of slavery into new territories. The terror of the breeding program cemented Northern resistance to slavery and destroyed any illusion that moderate politicians could treat the system as a harmless economic arrangement capable of gradual reform. The documented proof of systematic infanticide revealed that slavery inevitably resulted in the total dehumanization of enslaved people and opened the door to atrocities no civilized society could endure. Modern scholars who have examined the sealed records tied to Nancy's case have identified her as one of the most effective individual resistors in the history of American bondage. Her calculated pursuit of vengeance, her preservation of documentation, and her success in exposing the breeding program network displayed a degree of strategy and execution that was unmatched among the enslaved of her time. Nancy's triumph in weaponizing the tools of scientific racism against their architects proved that enslaved people possessed the intelligence and ability that racist ideologies denied them. Her literacy, her grasp of chemistry and botany, and her capacity to design and carry out a complex campaign of justice shattered every belief slaveholders held about the mental limits of Africans in America. Yet perhaps the most important part of Nancy's legacy was her achievement in safeguarding her daughter and securing the survival of her bloodline, despite the deliberate effort to erase them through the breeding project. The child condemned to death by Dr. Harwick's warped system of evaluation not only survived, but grew into a teacher and activist devoted to educating freed slaves and preserving the memories of those who had died pursuing liberty. Nancy Green herself vanished after her removal from Harwick Plantation, and no official record of her end was ever made public. Some reports suggest she was secretly executed to prevent her testimony from further exposing the program and its collaborators. Others insist she was placed in a mental institution where she lived the remainder of her days in isolation, slowly consumed by the trauma of what she had endured and what she had been compelled to do. Yet there are also stories whispered through the Underground Railroad and carried in the oral traditions of escapees that claim Nancy escaped during her transfer, reached Canada, and was reunited with her daughter, living her final years in freedom. These tales, unverifiable yet treasured, speak of a woman who refused to let her sacrifice be wasted and who kept fighting for justice until her last breath. This enduring mystery reveals that the horrors of American slavery stretched far beyond economic exploitation. The systemic stripping of humanity from the enslaved produced crimes unimaginable in any other context, and the pseudoscientific doctrines devised to defend these crimes were often more monstrous than the institution itself. The legacy of Nancy Green reminds us that resistance took many forms, and that even in the deepest shadows, individuals could carve paths to strike back against injustice and defend the ones they loved. Her deliberate strategy of retribution and her success in exposing the truth of the breeding programs demonstrate that enslaved people had agency and intelligence their oppressors refused to acknowledge. What do you make of Nancy Green's story? Do you think her actions were justified in light of the crimes inflicted upon her family? Were her methods excessive, or was excess required to confront such systematic evil? Share your thoughts in the comments and reflect on this grim chapter of American history. If this tale gripped you and you want more horror-laced histories like it, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Until next time.